What if I told you 3 centuries of history never happened? Not lost, not forgotten, fabricated. Whole kings, empires, and wars, written down, painted, chronicled, prayed about, yet allegedly as fake as a modern politician's smile. The idea sounds ridiculous, right? Like the kind of late-night conspiracy you'd overhear from someone 2 beers too deep. And yet, there's a theory. A theory that says the years 614 to 911 AD simply do not exist. Which means you, my friend, are technically living in the year 1725. Take a breath. Look around your room. Your phone, your coffee, your tax bills. All of it, unfolding centuries earlier than you thought. Feels unsettling, doesn't it? Like history just shifted beneath your feet. But don't worry. Tonight we're going to ease into this darkness slowly. You'll get comfortable. You'll probably laugh, nervously, when the evidence starts stacking up. And then, as the cracks spread across the story of our past, you'll wonder whether the so-called Dark Ages were really a void of ignorance, or a carefully planted lie. So, let's begin. You wake up in the ruins of Rome. Not literally, though it feels that way. The once mighty empire has collapsed, the aqueducts are crumbling, and people are suddenly more interested in goats than gladiators. Historians call this the Dark Ages. And for good reason. Written records? Almost none. Literacy? Barely alive in monasteries. Cities? Shrinking into ghost towns. It's as if civilization took one look at the 5th century and said, "You know what, I'm done," before pulling the blanket over its head. And here's the weird part. The timeline gets murky. Between the fall of Rome and the rise of the High Middle Ages, things don't quite add up. There's a scarcity of architecture, coins, pottery, inscriptions. It's like Europe collectively forgot how to leave breadcrumbs for future archaeologists. Enter the conspiracy. Imagine someone stepping into this gap and whispering, "What if nothing here actually happened?" And suddenly the silence of those centuries doesn't look like decay. It looks like a forgery. Think about it. When you picture medieval Europe, what comes to mind? Castles, knights, kings with questionable hygiene. But the centuries in question, 614 to 911, don't really give you much of that. Instead, they give you almost nothing. A quiet stretch of history, where very few people seem to be doing anything worth writing down. Suspiciously quiet. Of course, the official story is that these were hard times. Plagues. Collapsing trade networks. People simply weren't keeping records. But the phantom time theory flips that on its head. It suggests those centuries weren't poorly documented, they were never real to begin with. Congratulations. We're already standing at the edge of one of history's strangest rabbit holes. And it only gets darker from here. Fast forward to the 1990s. A German historian named Heribert Illig sits at his desk, staring at a calendar. Maybe he has coffee. Maybe he's just had enough of the Middle Ages being weird. Either way, he decides something is off. Very off. Illig publishes a theory, the phantom time hypothesis. His claim? Roughly 300 years, from 614 to 911 AD, were invented, added to the timeline like a sneaky footnote. And the culprits? None other than the power players of the early medieval world. According to Illig, 3 men orchestrated the greatest historical cover-up of all time: Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. Imagine the scene. 3 rulers, sipping wine by candlelight, deciding history itself needed a little remodeling. Well, for prestige, of course. Otto III allegedly wanted the glory of reigning during the year 1000. The church wanted symbolic control of the millennium, the grand turn-of-the-clock moment. Constantine? He simply wanted his empire to appear more ancient and continuous than it was. And so, Illig argued they invented centuries. Drafted kings who never lived. Battles that were never fought. Cathedrals that were never built. Then, like master stage magicians, they waved their hands and told the world to believe it. It's absurd, isn't it? Yet once the idea lodges in your mind, you can't help but wonder. Especially when you remember how fragile history really is. Written records, after all, are just ink on parchment. Easy to alter. Easy to destroy. Easier still to create from scratch. So here you are, staring at the possibility that Otto, Sylvester, and Constantine didn't just rule empires, they ruled time itself. All right, deep breath. Time to talk about evidence. Or at least the illusion of it. Illig's supporters point to archaeology. Or rather, the lack of it. If the years 614 to 911 AD really existed, where are the layers of buildings, artifacts, and inscriptions to prove it? The material record feels strangely thin. As if Europe simply took a nap for 3 centuries. Then there's the calendar problem. The Gregorian calendar, introduced in 1582, fixed a drift that had accumulated since the days of Julius Caesar's Julian calendar. But the math, Illig claimed, doesn't line up. If centuries really passed, the drift should have been larger. Unless, of course, those missing years never happened. And then, architecture. According to Illig, Europe seems to leapfrog styles. One moment you're looking at early medieval wooden huts, the next at high medieval stone cathedrals. The missing centuries explain the jump. Or so he said. It all sounds compelling at 2 a.m. when you're half convinced the shadows in your hallway are alive. Sparse archaeology, suspicious calendars, architectural leaps. Illig bundled them all into a tidy package and declared, "See? Phantom time." But here's the punchline. For every eerie gap, there's usually a dull explanation. Wars destroy records. Plagues halt construction. Parchment burns. Humans forget to write things down. History is messy, sometimes boringly so. Still, the gaps remain. And once you see them, it's hard to unsee. Congratulations. You've just dipped your toes into one of history's strangest mysteries. And spoiler alert, it only gets worse from here. You settle back into your chair. Maybe there's a candle flickering nearby, maybe just the glow of a screen, but either way, it's time to stare down one of history's stranger ideas, the phantom time hypothesis. Imagine living in a world where centuries vanish like mist. One day, it's 613 AD. You wake up. You eat your meager breakfast. You walk to the market, avoid tripping over a stray goat, and complain about taxes to a local official. The next day, somehow, it's 912 AD. You blink. Did you nap for 300 years? Was someone keeping a diary of your life without you knowing? Heribert Illig, the German historian who proposed this idea in the 1990s, suggested something equally audacious. According to him, the years 614 to 911 AD simply never happened. They were inserted retroactively into the historical record. Kings were fabricated. Battles never fought. Churches supposedly built on sand. And the rest of us, for centuries, have been dutifully believing it all. To help you picture this, think of a timeline. A straight line marching from Rome's fall to the rise of Charlemagne. Now, imagine someone cutting out a chunk of it and gluing the ends back together. Looks continuous at first glance, right? But take a closer look. The paper is thinner there. The glue is visible. The dates feel through. Illig didn't just stop at saying, someone made it up. He named names. Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII supposedly orchestrated this grand forgery. Their goal? To make the year 1000 AD appear as a milestone worth celebrating, a symbolic end of an era, carefully crafted to boost prestige, consolidate power, and, naturally, awe the peasants who had no calendars anyway. It's almost too cinematic. 3 leaders, plotting together, altering the timeline of the world like mischievous children rearranging a history textbook. And yet, in this narrative, it all makes sense. Europe's records were already shaky, monasteries were the main scribes, and the collapse of Rome left wide gaps in documentation. Perfect conditions for a time heist. The theory leans heavily on anomalies in records. Sparse architecture, odd calendar calculations, and sudden jumps in cultural artifacts were, according to Illig, clues. The fabric of history itself had been subtly doctored. Every missing manuscript, every oddly dated coin, every chronicle that seems just a little too neat, all part of a carefully woven illusion. Now let's pause. Take a moment to consider the implications. If this is true, your understanding of medieval history is a house of cards. Charlemagne's coronation? Fabricated. The Saxon Wars? Mostly fables. The Dark Ages? Not dark because of ignorance, but dark because someone deliberately erased the lights. It's unsettling, but also strangely thrilling. There's a dark humor in imagining kings who never existed, walking across the pages of history as if by magic. You can almost hear the chroniclers of the time muttering to themselves, "Sure, I'll just write this down. Nobody will check for 300 years anyway." Of course, the real world isn't quite so neat. Mainstream historians are skeptical. Archaeology exists. Coins and pottery date to those years. Astronomical events, like eclipses, were recorded, and they align with modern calculations. But for now, let's stay in the story. Suspend disbelief. Walk through the idea as if the centuries really could vanish. Because part of the fun and the terror of the phantom time hypothesis is imagining what life would look like if history itself were a prank played on you, 3 centuries in the making. Congratulations! You're officially inside the rabbit hole. And as we move forward, the walls are going to get even stranger. So now that you've peeked into the possibility of vanished centuries, it's time to look at the evidence. Or, depending on your perspective, the cleverly curated gaps that make Illig's argument both eerie and frustrating. Start with archaeology. Walk through Europe in your mind. Picture early medieval towns, little more than clusters of wooden huts, smoke curling from hearths, muddy streets, and occasional stench from animals wandering wherever they please. Now imagine trying to dig up something from 614 to 911 AD. What do you find? Sparse pottery shards. A few coins. Maybe a foundation stone or two. Not exactly the treasure trove you'd expect from 3 centuries worth of human civilization. Illig pointed at this scarcity and raised an eyebrow. Notice how thin the material record is. He seems to whisper from his desk in the 1990s. Almost as if someone pressed pause on Europe for 300 years. It's tempting to imagine Europe taking a collective nap while the rest of the world quietly marched on. Then there's the calendar. Ah yes, the Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in 45 BC. Reliable enough, mostly. But by the 16th century, the Gregorian calendar had to fix a drift that had accumulated over time. The math, according to Illig, doesn't quite add up. If those 300 years had really passed, the drift should have been noticeably larger. That tiny discrepancy becomes, in his theory, a smoking gun. The calendar itself, slightly off, hinting that someone tampered with the flow of time. Next, architecture. Take a walk through a medieval city, or at least scroll through some photos in your head. Look at those early churches, small and plain. Then, suddenly, grand stone cathedrals appear, soaring arches, intricate carvings, and a level of craftsmanship that seems to leapfrog over earlier styles. For Illig, this architectural jump is suspicious. Too sudden, too neat, too convenient. Remove 3 centuries from the timeline, and the leap makes sense. It's like a magician pulling a cathedral out of a hat. And don't forget textual evidence. Chronicles from the period in question are scarce. Manuscripts? Often later copies. Written records? Sparse, sometimes contradictory. The Dark Ages weren't exactly overflowing with diligent record-keeping. For Illig, every missing or muddled manuscript was not a failure of preservation, but a hint that the story was being invented as it went along. Take all of these anomalies together: archaeological gaps, calendar quirks, architectural jumps, missing manuscripts, and you have a tidy little package. According to Illig, it all points to a simple conclusion. Those 300 years were a fiction. A fabrication. History, rewritten by a few powerful hands, slipping past the notice of the unsuspecting masses. It's a seductive theory, isn't it? You can almost hear the whispered laughter of Otto III and Sylvester II as they meticulously drafted decades that never happened, like playwrights staging a 3-century-long performance. You can see Constantine VII consulting dusty scrolls, nodding at the illusion of continuity he's helping maintain. The world, blissfully unaware, keeps moving, marking birthdays, crowning kings, and planting crops, completely oblivious to the time stolen from them. Of course, as with all good conspiracies, it's frustratingly hard to prove. Sparse evidence is not proof. Missing data is not confirmation. But the gaps, oh the gaps, are deliciously suspicious. They invite you to lean closer, to squint at the timeline, to wonder, could the past be as malleable as this theory claims? And that's the thrill of phantom time. Not necessarily that it's true. Not necessarily that Otto III or Sylvester II actually edited the centuries like a cosmic Photoshop. But that, for a moment, you can imagine the world running on a history someone else wrote for you, complete with gaps, jumps, and clever omissions. It's eerie, a little unsettling, and strangely almost fun. Congrats. You've just examined the evidence, or at least the evidence that makes you question evidence itself. And now, it's time to ask the next question. Who, if anyone, would benefit from such a colossal temporal scam? Now that you've seen the alleged evidence, or at least the suspicious gaps, it's time to ask the natural next question. Who stood to gain from inventing 300 years of history? Because let's face it, rewriting centuries isn't exactly a hobby you pick up on a rainy afternoon. Someone had to benefit. Enter Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor, the man who, according to Illig, had the idea that the year 1000 AD should be a landmark of divine prestige. Imagine Otto sitting in his palace, surrounded by candles, maps, and advisors who are too polite to say, you do realize that's 3 centuries of work? He wanted to rule at a symbolic turning point, to make the millennium appear meaningful, monumental, almost sacred. Why settle for ordinary history when you could stage manage time itself? Then there's Pope Sylvester II, the man with the tall hat and, presumably, a sly smile. For the Church, the millennium wasn't just a number, it was a statement. A way to remind the faithful that God and the Church were in charge of the cosmic clock. Control the timeline, control perception. A little tweak here, a little fabricated king there, and suddenly the Church owns not just eternity in theory, but the calendar in practice. Genius. Evil genius, depending on how you feel about fabricated centuries. And don't forget Constantine VII in Byzantium. While the Western rulers were staging their millennium, Constantine allegedly wanted continuity. He wanted his empire to appear ancient, unbroken, venerable, a civilization that had survived the Dark Ages, even if those centuries were mostly invented. By filling the gaps with believable characters and events, the Byzantine court gained legitimacy and avoided awkward questions about lost centuries. Think about it for a second. 3 rulers, thousands of miles apart, all with slightly different agendas, allegedly coordinating to insert 3 centuries into the world's timeline. It's the ultimate long con, stretching far beyond a political scandal or tax evasion. If true, it's like rewriting the rules of the game while everyone else is still learning to play. And the kicker? Most of us never notice. You, reading this, probably felt a tingle of disbelief, maybe even amusement. But the world moved on. People were born, died, married, fought wars, built cathedrals, and celebrated festivals, entirely unaware that someone might have been editing the script behind the scenes. If you think that sounds sinister, it is. But it's also strangely elegant. History as a carefully staged theater production, with the audience none the wiser. Of course, this raises another question. If 3 centuries were invented, why were they invented in the first place? Prestige and legitimacy, mainly. But also power. The idea of controlling the narrative isn't new. Kings have been doing it for millennia. Otto wanted symbolic glory. Sylvester wanted spiritual authority. Constantine wanted political continuity. Together, they allegedly created a phantom past so convincing that most of the world still believes it today. It's almost funny in a dark way. Imagine people in the Middle Ages complaining about taxes or plagues or lost livestock, never realizing that the calendar itself was rigged. 300 years and still no good roads, you can almost hear them grumble. And meanwhile, somewhere in history's background, the masterminds of phantom time are silently nodding, satisfied with their invisible handiwork. And that's the lesson here. If you want to control perception, you don't just control news or propaganda. You control time itself. Make the world believe the past was different, and the present starts to feel exactly as you planned. The ultimate power play. Congrats. You've met the supposed beneficiaries. You've peeked at the players behind the alleged centuries that never were. And now, it's time to look at the other side of the story, the skeptics, the counterarguments, and the evidence that keeps this theory from being universally accepted. Alright. So far, you've wandered through a world where 3 centuries might have been invented, where emperors and popes allegedly played fast and loose with time itself. Creepy, right? But hold on to your candlestick, because not everyone buys this theory. In fact, most historians think it's, well, let's say, creative at best. First, archaeology. Remember the supposed gaps? The thin layers of artifacts? Turns out, if you dig carefully, you find coins, pottery, and tools dating right smack in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. Real stuff made by real people who were definitely alive, eating, working, and occasionally dying from causes that nobody bothered to record. The material record exists. It's not missing. It's just messy. And messy is not the same as fabricated. Then there's dendrochronology, counting tree rings. Trees, as it happens, are excellent timekeepers. You can date wood used in buildings or furniture to the exact year it grew. Guess what? Those rings match the timeline we thought we knew. No phantom centuries hiding in the grain. Nature doesn't lie, even if emperors allegedly do. And we can't forget astronomy. Eclipses, comets, planetary alignments. People recorded these events. Monks, scholars, sometimes terrified peasants, they wrote down what they saw in the sky. Modern astronomers can trace these phenomena back and confirm the dates. If 300 years had been invented, the stars themselves would be lying. Spoiler alert, they aren't. They never lie. There's also written evidence. Yes, the manuscripts are scarce and occasionally contradictory. But scarcity isn't proof of fabrication. Many surviving documents come from distant regions, not the alleged mastermind's courts. They talk about kings, battles, and events we can verify through multiple sources. Fabricating 3 centuries of history across an entire continent without leaving a single independent trace? That's not a conspiracy, that's magical thinking. Then there's human memory, or more accurately, the records of chroniclers. Medieval scribes were meticulous, sometimes annoyingly so, about recording oddities, disasters, or anything worth noting. If someone really had invented 3 centuries, it's hard to believe nobody ever leaked a detail, made a marginal note, or grumbled in a letter that later survived. Yet the sources align reasonably well across regions. But here's the ironic part. Even though the phantom time hypothesis is widely rejected, it highlights something important. The Dark Ages really were dark. Not because they were invented, but because the records are fragmented, inconsistent, and sometimes almost invisible. Wars, plagues, famine, and the collapse of centralized power all contributed to gaps. The universe didn't conspire to erase history. History just got messy. Humans are forgetful, chaotic, and terrible at record-keeping. So, while the idea of vanished centuries is thrilling, like walking through a haunted corridor where the clocks have stopped, the skeptic's evidence is compelling. Coins, rings, eclipses, manuscripts, all line up. Time marches on, even if you occasionally misplace your calendar. The stars, after all, aren't in on the conspiracy. And yet, there's something poetic about imagining it. Even if Illig was wrong, even if Otto III didn't fiddle with the timeline, the notion of phantom centuries makes the Dark Ages feel mysterious in a way that real history sometimes doesn't. You can almost hear the echo of forgotten lives, silent scribes, lost battles, and wonder how much of our past will always be shrouded in shadows. Congrats! You've seen both sides now. The thrilling conspiracy and the grounded, evidence-based counterarguments. You're standing at the crossroads of imagination and reality. And the path ahead? That's where the real mysteries of the Dark Ages, literacy collapses, monastic control of knowledge, and vanished manuscripts await. So, the phantom time hypothesis might be mostly a fun mental exercise, a giant, centuries-long practical joke, but let's not pretend the Dark Ages were boring or uneventful. No, those centuries have enough real mysteries to keep any curious mind wide awake at night. And some of them are almost as eerie as a 3th-century cover-up. First, literacy. You wake up in a village somewhere in the 8th century. Most people around you can barely scratch their names onto a clay tablet. The ability to read and write is confined to monasteries, and even then, monks are busy copying scrolls instead of writing anything new. It's a world where knowledge is a whisper, hidden behind stone walls and candlelight. Information isn't shared freely, it's hoarded, locked away, and guarded like treasure. No Wikipedia. No Library of Alexandria Redex. Just quiet scribes, ink-stained fingers, and the occasional typo that might live on forever because nobody else can read it. Then there's the curious phenomenon of lost manuscripts. Books burn. Libraries collapse. Monasteries are raided. And even if a text survives, sometimes it's rewritten, edited, or improved by some zealous monk who thought they were helping posterity. Every page you might have wanted to read about daily life, small rebellions, or local tragedies may have vanished. A whole world of lived experiences reduced to dust. It's like history is playing a game of hide and seek with you, and it's winning. Monastic control of knowledge amplifies the mystery. If you were a monk, you didn't just copy books, you decided what was important. You curated the story of the world. Some events were emphasized. Others quietly ignored. One monastery's chronicler might glorify a king who barely existed in another region, while another chronicler omits a battle that destroyed a village. The truth? It's lost in translation, lost in ink, lost in the agendas of men who were essentially gatekeepers of memory. And yet, even with these gaps, life continued in its messy, stubborn way. People farmed, fought, married, and died. Children were born, adults argued over land, and taxes were levied, all while the official history might have been incomplete or biased. You can almost feel the disconnect, the lived experience of people versus the recorded experience of the scribes. And for modern historians, that gap is tantalizing. The shadows of the Dark Ages aren't empty, they're thick, tangled, and sometimes indecipherable. Even today, we find traces. Archaeologists stumble across forgotten villages, buried churches, and hidden graves. Every new discovery slightly rearranges the puzzle. Coins, pottery, and inscriptions appear where none were expected. And yet, there's always a whisper of mystery. Who lived here? What exactly did they do? How did they think? Sometimes the past refuses to speak clearly, leaving us guessing, imagining, or entertaining wild hypotheses, like phantom time. There's also the irony. The Dark Ages are dark not because the people were stupid, lazy, or violent, although life was harsh, but because the evidence of their existence is patchy. And humans are wired to notice patterns, to look for meaning, to fill in blanks. So when 3 centuries allegedly vanish, it feels plausible, almost comforting, to imagine a grand conspiracy. The gaps beg for stories. They beg for answers. And even if the conspiracy is false, the curiosity it sparks is real. So, as you sit here, imagining candlelight flickering on cracked stone walls, think about the countless lives that passed unnoticed. The small joys, the heartbreaks, the mundane acts of survival, all largely invisible to history. It's a reminder that even without a conspiracy, the Dark Ages are enigmatic, shadowed, and full of mysteries that will never fully yield their secrets. Congrats! You've now wandered through the real mysteries of the Dark Ages. The missing manuscripts, the collapse of literacy, the monks who decided history's narrative, all shadows lurking in a time that's already hard to see clearly. And next, we'll try to tie it all together, to reflect on what it means when entire centuries vanish into the fog, real or imagined. You've wandered through vanishing centuries, whispered conspiracies, suspicious gaps, and shadowy monasteries. You've seen the alleged evidence for a 3-century fabrication and the counterarguments that insist reality marches on uninterrupted. And now it's time to step back, breathe, and let the puzzle settle, if only slightly, in your mind. Think about it. Whether or not those 300 years were fabricated, you've been walking through a world where history is slippery. The Dark Ages are aptly named not because people were incompetent or lazy, though life was undeniably harsh, but because the record itself is fractured. And fractured records are a perfect playground for imagination. You can almost see Otto III polishing his crown, Sylvester II adjusting his robes, Constantine VII staring at a parchment and thinking, "We'll make the past look convincing enough that no one will ever notice." But here's the point worth lingering on. History is written by the victors. Always has been, always will be. And the Dark Ages are a testament to that fact. Monks and kings, empires and scribes, they decided what to record and what to forget. Battles are commemorated, rulers glorified, failures conveniently ignored. And because our evidence is incomplete, your mind, and mine, naturally fills the gaps. Sometimes with scholarly deduction. Sometimes with imaginative conspiracy theories. Sometimes with 3 centuries vanishing like mist. It's tempting, of course, to want a neat story. To want a timeline where events flow smoothly, kings rise and fall predictably, and monuments appear in logical progression. But the real past rarely obliges. The Dark Ages are messy, chaotic, and inconsistent. Coins show up in unexpected places. Manuscripts contradict each other. Buildings appear and disappear. Stars continue to cross the sky regardless of what humans believe. It's a world that resists tidy narratives. And that's why the phantom time hypothesis is so fascinating. Even if it's wrong, and mainstream historians insist it is, it highlights the tension between what actually happened and what we can reconstruct. Between lived experience and recorded memory. Between truth and the gaps our minds are desperate to fill. You start to realize that missing centuries, lost manuscripts, and vanished villages are less about deceit and more about the fragility of memory itself. There's something humbling in this. You are, in a sense, a detective peering through the fog of centuries. You're trying to make sense of a past that is partially visible, partially obscured, partially invented by circumstance or imagination. And sometimes, the absence of certainty is the most compelling part of all. You can almost smell the smoke from a long-extinct hearth. Feel the chill of stone floors in a monastery where no one will ever read your thoughts. Hear the scratching of quills on parchment, marking events that may have been exaggerated, forgotten, or misdated. And as you do, you realize, history isn't a static story. It's a living, breathing narrative, imperfect, incomplete, endlessly fascinating. So, whether those 300 years were real or imagined, one thing is certain. The Dark Ages remind us that history is not just about what happened. It's about how we remember, how we interpret, and how the shadows of the past shape our understanding of the present. Even gaps, mistakes, and mysteries have meaning. They challenge us to question, to imagine, and to acknowledge that the past is often stranger than the neat narratives textbooks present. Congrats! You've reached the reflection point. You've walked the line between conspiracy and reality, between shadow and substance. You've seen how the Dark Ages can vanish, reappear, and persist in the gaps of human memory. And now, all that's left is to carry this awareness forward, to peer at history with curiosity, skepticism, and a touch of wonder. Because whether 300 years were erased or simply forgotten, the lesson remains. The past is never fully known, and that uncertainty is what makes it endlessly fascinating. You lean back and let it sink in. 300 years of history, gone, or at least suspiciously murky. Kings, battles, and empires all possibly invented. Or maybe not. The line between reality and imagination in the Dark Ages is so thin you could cut it with a quill. And yet, here you are, still anchored in the present, wondering how much of what you think you know is actually true. It's tempting to dismiss the phantom time hypothesis outright. The skeptics, after all, have solid arguments: coins, pottery, manuscripts, eclipses. Science and archaeology insist that those centuries existed. But then you remember the gaps. The lost manuscripts. The sudden leaps in architecture. The monasteries guarding knowledge like dragons hoarding gold. Even if the conspiracy isn't real, the mystery is undeniable. There's something in that shadowy silence that beckons you closer. And that's the real allure of history, isn't it? Not certainty. Not the neat, boxed-up dates and tidy timelines. It's the gaps. The questions that refuse easy answers. The shadows where imagination meets evidence. Tonight, you've walked those shadowed corridors, peered into vanished centuries, and glimpsed the edges of a world that is more mysterious than you might have thought. So here's where you get to participate. You've been an observer, a traveler through the murky corridors of the Dark Ages. But now you can become a thinker. Ask yourself, do you believe the 300 years were erased, carefully invented by emperors and popes? Or do you think history was simply messy, chaotic, and cruelly forgetful? Either way, you're part of the conversation. Your curiosity keeps the past alive, because history isn't just what happened, it's what we remember, question, and debate. If you're still awake, still leaning in with a mix of disbelief and fascination, here's a small suggestion. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your mind wander. Imagine the flickering candlelight in a long-forgotten monastery. Hear the scratch of quills. Smell the damp stone and burning parchment. Imagine kings who never existed walking across the pages of history, as real to some chroniclers as your own reflection is to you. And while you do that, consider this. The Dark Ages may be a black hole of memory, but curiosity is the light that lets us peer inside. It doesn't matter whether Illig was right or wrong. The point is that you've questioned, imagined, and explored. You've held history up to the light and noticed its cracks. And that, perhaps, is more valuable than certainty itself. Before you drift too far into thought, one last thing. The conversation doesn't end here. There are more mysteries, more vanished voices, more questions hiding in the folds of history. And you can continue exploring them. Comment below with your thoughts. Do you believe in phantom time, or do you side with the skeptics? Share where you're watching from, your theories, or even your favorite eerie historical gaps. It's your curiosity that keeps history alive. And if you enjoyed this slow, unsettling walk through centuries, consider subscribing. You'll be the first to know when we uncover the next mystery. Another shadow, another vanishing act, another place where the past refuses to be pinned down. It's not just about history. It's about exploring the spaces between the facts, the silences, and the whispers of the past. Congrats! You've survived the journey through the Dark Ages, at least for tonight. You've glimpsed a world where time itself might have been rewritten, and where uncertainty and imagination blend into a strange, beautiful twilight. Rest easy, knowing the past is more alive and more mysterious than any textbook could ever admit. You thought you'd seen the Dark Ages in full, didn't you? 3 centuries vanished, emperors plotting, monks hoarding knowledge. But the shadows stretch further. Even within the periods we do think happened, gaps yawn like endless chasms, daring you to fall in. And if you lean too close, you might see the edges of lives that were lived, and then almost forgotten entirely. Consider the chronicles themselves. You open a manuscript, parchment brittle, ink faded, and immediately notice the choices made by the scribes. Battles are detailed in one region and omitted in another. Kings are glorified in one text, scorned in another. Sometimes, you get a curious note in the margin. A simple observation, like a monk remarking, "The harvest failed again," or "A comet appeared over the abbey." These little entries, almost thrown away, are often the only traces of ordinary life. And yet, they are fleeting, fragmentary. One slip of a quill, one burned library, and the story of entire villages disappears. You wander through these manuscripts like a ghost. You see festivals, weddings, deaths, mundane events, recorded in a way that feels intimate, almost painfully human. But they are punctuated by gaps so large that you can imagine entire generations vanishing without leaving a single trace. And sometimes, when you stare long enough, it's easy to understand why someone might imagine phantom time. Those gaps are tempting. They call out for a story to fill them, whether real or imagined. Even the landscape itself conspires to obscure history. Forests reclaim ruins. Rivers shift courses, burying settlements beneath silt and sediment. Villages collapse, leaving only foundations for archaeologists to stumble over centuries later. You can almost picture the lost communities, children playing in dirt streets, farmers cursing their stubborn oxen, merchants bartering with beads that will never be found. And now, centuries later, all of it is faintly remembered, if remembered at all. And then there's the matter of memory, collective memory, the kind that is transmitted orally. Stories told around fires, sung in chants, or recited during rituals. They're rich, vivid, full of human emotion, and yet frustratingly unreliable. By the time they're written down, centuries later, they're distorted. Heroes become gods, minor events turn into miracles, tragedies morph into allegories. The past becomes a story shaped not by what happened, but by what people felt they needed to remember. The irony is delicious. You, sitting here, are trying to reconstruct the past using fragments, gaps, and secondhand tales. You are, in a way, doing the same work as the monks and chroniclers, sifting, guessing, imagining. Only your monastery is a chair, your scrolls are digital screens, and your quill is a cursor. And just like them, you realize that even with the best intentions, history is never fully known. Yet in this darkness, there is beauty. The gaps, the missing centuries, the vanished villages, they invite curiosity, creativity, and imagination. You can imagine the lives that were lived in silence, the struggles that were unrecorded, the laughter that went unheard. The past, you see, is not just a series of events. It's a tapestry woven from both fact and absence, threads and empty spaces. And sometimes, the spaces themselves tell the most compelling stories. Congratulations! You've now wandered deeper into the shadows between the chronicles. You've seen that even the recorded centuries contain mysteries, small vanishings, and subtle erasures. You've glimpsed the spaces where imagination meets evidence, and where history flirts with uncertainty. And if you thought the Dark Ages were simply dark, you now know they are far richer, far stranger, and far more alive in their silence than most of us dare to imagine. You step through the heavy wooden doors of a monastery. The scent of smoke, wax, and damp stone hits you first. The cold floor presses against your feet. Candles flicker along the walls, illuminating rows of parchment scrolls stacked precariously on dusty shelves. The quiet here is almost suffocating, broken only by the faint scratching of quills. This is the engine of memory, the vault where Europe's past survived, and sometimes where it was rewritten. Monks were the keepers of knowledge, the archivists of the Dark Ages. And while their devotion is admirable, their work was far from neutral. Every scroll copied, every book preserved, was subject to interpretation, bias, and personal whim. You can almost see a monk pausing mid-sentence, deciding whether to emphasize a king's piety or downplay a local rebellion. One wrong annotation, one omitted battle, and centuries later, historians would scratch their heads, wondering if a whole chapter of life had vanished. The rhythm of monastic life dictated what got recorded. Morning prayers, meals, work in the fields or scriptorium, evening prayers. A strict, repetitive cadence that shaped both the mind and the text. Time itself felt different here, stretched and compressed by ritual. Days might blur together, and the act of copying texts became a meditative obsession. You might imagine that in such a quiet, cloistered world, even minor errors, a miswritten date, a miscopied name, could ripple forward through history, unnoticed until centuries later. And yes, some monks were creative. Some might embellish stories of saints or miracles to inspire faith or impress patrons. Others were meticulous, obsessively ensuring accuracy, noting every detail of a comet's path or a local famine. But regardless of intent, they were shaping history with every stroke of ink. In a world where most people were illiterate, the monk held the ultimate power, the power to decide what future generations would know or think they knew. Imagine walking among these monks, listening to the scratch of quills, the whispered Latin prayers, the muffled chants echoing against stone walls. Every corner hides potential insight or misdirection. One monk's note might describe a minor skirmish that never appears elsewhere. Another might exaggerate a ruler's piety to reinforce the church's authority. And centuries later, we attempt to piece together the truth from these fragments, knowing full well that the past we reconstruct is filtered through human hands, hands that were fallible, selective, and sometimes downright mischievous. It's also ironic. You, a modern observer, rely on these monks for the only surviving records of daily life, politics, and religion in the Dark Ages. And yet, they were not neutral observers. They were players in the same world they documented, influenced by power, fear, and ambition. Their monasteries were sanctuaries, yes, but also instruments of control, shaping collective memory in ways subtle and profound. The more you consider it, the more you realize that history is not a static record. It's a conversation across centuries, with whispers of bias, omission, and invention echoing through time. The monks, for all their devotion, were both preservers and interpreters, and sometimes, intentionally or not, their interpretation became the only surviving reality. Congratulations! You've now stepped inside the walls where knowledge was both protected and molded. You've seen how the scribes' hands guided the story of Europe, how daily rituals affected the records they produced, and how the lives of ordinary people might have been obscured, exaggerated, or lost entirely. The Dark Ages are not just a period of scarcity and mystery, they are a world shaped by human intention, patience, and the subtle power of the pen. You step into another quiet chamber, this one lined with shelves that should have groaned under the weight of centuries of knowledge. But many shelves are empty, dust thick in the corners, as if the books themselves had quietly evaporated. This is the haunting reality of the Dark Ages, knowledge preserved, but precariously. So much of it is lost, vanished manuscripts, destroyed libraries, memories turned to ash. And every empty shelf is a whisper of stories that will never reach you. Picture a monastery library in its prime. Scrolls and codices stacked haphazardly, monks hunched over candlelight, copying texts with painstaking care. Hours stretch into days. Pages are coated with ink, sometimes corrected, sometimes overwritten. But all around, danger lurks. Wood rot, fire, dampness, natural enemies. Viking raids or local wars, human enemies. One misstep, one spark, and centuries of labor vanish in smoke. And that smoke carries with it the stories of lives, thoughts, and events that may never be recovered. Even surviving manuscripts are fragile. Time has a cruel way of twisting parchment and fading ink. Pages crumble under your fingers. Letters blur into ink blotches. The text that once recorded law, poetry, history, or philosophy now becomes barely legible fragments. Scholars can piece together parts, cross-reference, and reconstruct, but what is lost is forever gone. And in that loss lies the thrill and the terror of the Dark Ages. You are reading shadows, not the whole picture. Some libraries weren't lost to accident but to intent. When new regimes rose, conquering armies sometimes saw books as symbols of the old order, and libraries burned. Monks and scholars themselves occasionally corrected history, excising texts that challenged authority or contradicted religious doctrine. You can almost imagine the conversations. Destroy this one, it might confuse the faithful. Leave that one, it glorifies our patron saint. The past, carefully curated, sometimes violently edited. Then there's the mystery of manuscripts that might have existed. References in surviving texts hint at works we'll never see. Histories of local regions, scientific treatises, collections of folklore, personal diaries. Scholars catch glimpses of these vanished works through marginal notes, citations, or complaints in letters. But they cannot read them. They exist only in absence, tantalizing and frustrating. It's as if the past is teasing you, saying, I was here, I mattered, but you won't know me. You realize that every lost manuscript is a lost life, a lost mind. Someone once thought it worth recording something, a thought, an event, a story. And now, that effort survives only in shadow. You are left piecing together a world from fragments, reconstructing history with as much care as a puzzle missing half its pieces. Every gap is both a challenge and an invitation. Fill it with imagination, speculation, or cautious inference. And here's the ironic beauty of it. The more you learn about what's missing, the more alive the Dark Ages feel. It's a paradox. Absence creates presence. The vanished libraries, burned scrolls, and missing codices make you lean closer, listen harder, think deeper. History becomes tactile. It whispers in empty spaces, in the smell of old parchment, in the faint scratches of ink, and in the silence where a library should be. Congratulations! You've now wandered through the spectral halls of lost manuscripts and vanished libraries. You've seen the fragility of recorded knowledge, the human hand shaping and sometimes destroying it, and the shadows of lives that left behind almost no trace. The Dark Ages are not just a period of missing centuries, they are a period of missing voices, and it is in these absences that the imagination thrives. You walk through a village in the Dark Ages. Children run through dirt streets, chickens squawk, and smoke curls from the kitchens. But one thing is immediately clear: very few people can read the signs, the letters, or even their own names. Literacy is scarce, fragile, and confined almost entirely to monasteries. The collapse of literacy is one of the era's quietest, yet most profound mysteries. And it shapes everything you've seen so far. Imagine being alive in this world. Messages are carried by word of mouth. Orders are issued verbally. Contracts, when they exist, are read aloud to the parties involved. Knowledge, law, and culture are communicated orally, vulnerable to memory lapses, exaggeration, and outright invention. It's a world where truth is ephemeral, shifting like mist over a marsh. One misremembered detail can ripple forward through generations, shaping what people believe actually happened. The consequences are enormous. Without widespread literacy, historical records are sparse and uneven. The voices that survive are mostly those of monks and chroniclers, often removed from everyday life. Ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, exist almost entirely in the shadow of history. Their experiences, struggles, and small triumphs rarely get recorded. You can almost hear them complaining, "3 winters ago, my ox died. Nobody wrote it down. Does it even matter?" And for history, it often doesn't. This scarcity of literacy also makes society easier to control. Knowledge is power, and the literate minority, the church, some nobles, and a few scholars, wielded it with subtlety. If most people cannot read, you can shape the narrative with almost no resistance. Records, laws, and stories are filtered through a tiny number of hands. What survives is not just history, but selected history, emphasizing what the powerful wanted remembered. The rest vanishes, fading like ink in rain. Think about education in this era. Children learned basic skills from parents and community members, but formal schooling was rare. Scribes were trained in monasteries, often beginning in childhood, but only a handful reached mastery. That creates another problem. The act of recording history becomes a gate-kept craft. Fewer scribes mean fewer records. Fewer records mean larger gaps in knowledge. And those gaps, you've already seen, are the very places where theories like phantom time find fertile ground. The collapse of literacy also contributed to the so-called cultural leap that puzzles historians. Architectural advances, changes in artistic styles, and sudden innovations sometimes appear to arrive fully formed, without clear precursors. When so much of the human story goes unrecorded, the surviving evidence can look disjointed. Imagine finding a cathedral in 900 AD without records of the craftsmen who built it. Suddenly, it seems miraculous, out of nowhere. And you start to wonder, were centuries really missing, or was the story just poorly told? There's a grim humor in this. People struggled to survive, built lives, and contributed to culture. Yet for centuries afterward, much of their existence is silent. No diaries, no letters, no local histories. Just traces, a fragment of pottery, a worn coin, a faded manuscript in a monastery cellar. And those traces shape your understanding of the Dark Ages, like trying to reconstruct a song from a few scattered notes. Congrats! You've now seen the collapse of literacy and how it shaped the world of the Dark Ages. You've wandered through a society where the majority could not read or write, where knowledge was centralized and fragile, and where everyday life often vanished from the historical record. You've walked the corridors of silence and realized that sometimes absence speaks louder than words. You wander the quiet halls of a monastery again, but this time, you're not just a visitor, you're a witness to power in its subtler form. The monks you see aren't wielding swords or crowns. Their weapon is ink. Their battlefield is parchment. And their victories? Entire generations of memory, carefully curated, subtly shaped, and sometimes deliberately rewritten. Monastic control over history is almost intoxicating to imagine. You lean over a scribe's shoulder, watching him copy a manuscript by candlelight. He pauses, frowns at a line, and crosses it out. A king's misdeeds disappear. A saint's minor miracle suddenly becomes legendary. You realize, this isn't just recording history. It's interpreting it, guiding how the world will remember itself for centuries. One monk, one quill, can decide what survives. The irony is thick. These men devoted their lives to God, to prayer, and to copying texts, yet by doing so, they became arbiters of power. Political authority, religious doctrine, social norms, all filtered through their work. A ruler's prestige might hinge on the careful recounting of victories. A community's legitimacy might rest on the miracles preserved in a dusty codex. And you, centuries later, are trying to reconstruct that past from the crumbs they left behind. Even within the monastic hierarchy, choices were made. Abbot, novice, scribe, each had influence, but the abbot's voice carried farthest. He decided which texts to preserve, which stories to amplify, and which inconvenient details to quietly ignore. You can almost hear the murmured arguments in candlelit corridors. If we include this battle, it might make the king look weak. Better to emphasize the saint's intervention instead. Every choice shapes the collective memory, every omission becomes part of the historical record by default. And it wasn't just about kings and saints. The monks also curated knowledge of daily life, festivals, weather patterns, local disputes. What was included, what was ignored, often depended on perceived relevance or moral lesson. You might discover that a devastating famine is recorded in one monastery's chronicle but absent in another's. A local uprising might be glorified or minimized depending on political allegiances. History, in their hands, is malleable. This control extends beyond the monastery walls. Nobles, emperors, and church officials relied on these monks to craft the narrative. They didn't just want events recorded, they wanted their version of events preserved. And the monks obliged. The past became a carefully constructed story, a selective tapestry of triumphs, failures, miracles, and moral lessons. Ordinary people had no voice. Their lives existed in fragments, traces, and occasional marginal notes. It's almost sinister in its subtlety. No one needed to forge entire centuries, as the phantom time hypothesis suggests. Sometimes, the selective recording of what already existed is enough to reshape perception, to make history feel incomplete, to create gaps where imagination thrives. The scribes were gatekeepers of memory, and memory is power. And here's the darkly humorous part. You, sitting in the 21st century, are piecing together this world from the fragments left behind. You are subject to the very same influence, in a way. The gaps, omissions, and selective records still shape your understanding. And you might wonder, as you lean closer to the shadows of the past, who truly controlled history? The rulers? The monks? Or simply time itself, eroding and hiding details until they are half forgotten? Congrats! You've walked the corridors where memory was curated, power was subtle, and history was crafted with a careful hand. You've seen how monks shaped the story of Europe, influencing what survives and what is lost. The Dark Ages are not merely dark because of missing years or vanished manuscripts. They are dark because knowledge was filtered, molded, and guarded, leaving you to navigate the shadows with only fragments to guide you. You leave the monastery for a moment and step into a village. The streets are muddy, the smell of hearth smoke thick, and the air filled with the low murmur of voices. Here, in the cracks between manuscripts and stone walls, history survives in a different form, oral tradition. Stories, songs, and folklore travel by word of mouth, whispered from one generation to the next. And while fragile, they are alive in a way that ink on parchment can never be. Imagine sitting by a fire, listening to a storyteller recount events from decades ago, or maybe centuries. A local battle, a heroic figure, a terrible famine. Details are fuzzy. Names change. Villagers embellish, exaggerate, and sometimes invent entirely new elements. One storyteller's hero might be another's villain. One minor storm becomes a legendary catastrophe. And yet, even distorted, these oral histories preserve memory in ways no manuscript ever could. You realize that oral tradition is a different kind of power. It's decentralized, communal, and resilient. A single firelit story can survive even if a library burns. It adapts with each retelling, shaped by the teller, the listeners, and the cultural context. Facts blur, but the essence, the human experience, persists. In a world where literacy has collapsed and manuscripts vanish, folklore becomes a lifeline. It carries warnings, morals, histories, and identities across generations. Consider the folklore about kings and saints. People may not have had access to official records, but they remembered victories, betrayals, and moral lessons. Songs immortalized battles and heroes. Tales explained natural disasters, plagues, and strange celestial events. Even events that might have been erased from written records could survive in exaggerated or allegorical form, hidden in narrative folds. You can almost hear a village elder saying, "We never wrote it down, but I'll tell you the story." And that story matters, even if it isn't perfectly accurate. There's also a dark humor in the gaps. By the time these oral histories are finally written down, they've changed so much that modern scholars sometimes scratch their heads. Names morph, places relocate, and causes of events are twisted beyond recognition. It's like a centuries-long game of telephone, with a dose of imagination, exaggeration, and local pride thrown in. Yet these errors are the very thing that keeps the past intriguing, rich, and occasionally baffling. Oral tradition also preserves the lives of ordinary people, the ones that scribes and chronicles often ignore. Village disputes, market gossip, heroic deeds of common folk, local tragedies, these might survive only as songs, chants, or bedtime stories. While kings and monks dominate written history, oral traditions ensure that the heartbeat of everyday life is not completely lost. You begin to see a parallel world, one written in stone and ink, and one whispered in the dark, equally important, equally alive. And here's the subtle irony. In trying to understand the Dark Ages, you rely on both. Written records give structure and chronology. Oral histories fill the gaps, add color, and preserve humanity. Both are fragile. Both are biased. And both force you to navigate the shadows, piecing together a story that is never complete, always partial, and endlessly fascinating. Congrats! You've now wandered into the world of oral tradition and folklore, where history lives not on parchment but in voices. You've seen how stories adapt, survive, and carry memory across generations, preserving lives and events that official records might have forgotten. In the Dark Ages, this was more than entertainment. It was survival. And it's in these whispered stories that the past reveals its hidden, stubborn heartbeat. You wander past a ruined village and stop in front of a partially standing cathedral. Its stones are weathered, yet somehow it seems impossibly advanced compared to what you've seen in surrounding villages. You tilt your head, squinting at the arches, flying buttresses, and intricately carved capitals. How did this leap in architecture happen seemingly out of nowhere? Welcome to one of the enduring mysteries of the Dark Ages, sudden architectural and technological leaps amidst gaps in knowledge and records. Imagine being an ordinary villager, working the fields or tending goats, watching as masons arrive from faraway places to build something that feels magical. They carve stone with precision, raise arches that defy gravity, and work according to knowledge you'll never fully understand. And when they leave, often little explanation survives. No instruction manuals. No detailed plans. Just walls, towers, and the occasional inscription. You're left to marvel, guess, and sometimes fear that these buildings appeared by divine intervention, or perhaps the work of very skilled, slightly mysterious humans. Part of the confusion comes from patchy documentation. Literacy is scarce, and monastic scribes often focus on saints, kings, or religious doctrine, not engineering techniques or village infrastructure. What survives in writing is fragmentary. A note here about a church consecration, a marginal comment about a worker's death, a cryptic reference to a mason from over the hills. But the buildings remain, speaking more eloquently than any chronicle. Stone does not lie, yet the story behind it is often gone. Technological leaps occur in other areas too. Metalworking, water mills, roads, even textile production sometimes seem to appear suddenly. You find an artifact, a coin, a tool, a piece of jewelry, and it demonstrates a technique that seems centuries ahead of its time. You wonder if the knowledge was passed quietly through apprenticeship, lost and rediscovered, or if gaps in surviving evidence make it appear sudden. Either way, it adds to the sense that the Dark Ages were uneven, a world of surprises, leaps, and disappearing knowledge. Here's the darkly humorous part. Centuries later, historians scratch their heads and wonder if these leaps are evidence of missing time. Maybe someone fabricated a few centuries, they joke quietly in academic papers. You, standing among the ruins, can't help but smile at the irony. The buildings, tools, and artifacts never intended to trick anyone are now used as clues in a centuries-old detective story. And the more you study them, the more you realize that human ingenuity is messy, unpredictable, and often survives in pockets rather than continuous streams. You also notice the social dimension. Advanced structures and tools often appear where patronage, wealth, or necessity converged. A local lord might commission a stone bridge, a monastery might invest in an intricate scriptorium, or a coastal town might build a fortified wall. Innovation is concentrated, unevenly distributed. One village appears frozen in time, while another suddenly leaps forward. From a distance of centuries, the pattern seems mysterious, almost deliberate, even though it's a natural consequence of resources, demand, and human ambition. And yet, the mystery persists. Each stone arch, each metal tool, each watermill whispers a story that survives independently of written record. They are clues scattered across time, fragments of knowledge that hint at ingenuity, creativity, and sometimes sheer desperation. They remind you that the Dark Ages were not uniformly dark, but uneven, unpredictable, and full of surprises. Congrats! You've now walked among the leaps in architecture and technology, seen how human skill can emerge in bursts, and understood how gaps in records magnify the sense of mystery. The Dark Ages are not simply defined by missing manuscripts or vanished centuries. They are a patchwork of brilliance, loss, and uneven development, a world where every stone and artifact tells a story you must imagine, reconstruct, and sometimes marvel at in silence. You tilt your head toward the sky. The stars are faint, the moon a thin crescent, and somewhere in the distance, the glow of a candle marks a monk's scriptorium. Here, amid flickering light and shadow, you begin to see another form of order in the chaos of the Dark Ages, the sky itself as a timekeeper. Celestial events, eclipses, comets, planetary alignments, were recorded with care, offering a kind of natural ledger for historians who came centuries later. Imagine a monk staring through a crude window, quill in hand, recording the appearance of a solar eclipse. He writes the date, sometimes with painstaking precision, sometimes approximate, notes its effect, and perhaps comments on the omen it might represent. This record, however sparse, becomes an anchor in time. Centuries later, astronomers can calculate the exact movement of celestial bodies, confirming the dates of eclipses, comets, or unusual planetary conjunctions. Even if kings lied or scribes embellished, the stars never do. It's almost amusing. Human history is messy, but the universe keeps perfect time. If someone claimed that 300 years were invented, astronomers would notice immediately. The stars wouldn't match. Eclipses would be off. Yet the evidence aligns. Each recorded celestial event ties the human story to reality in a way that no manuscript, however biased, can. It's a cosmic audit, impartial and relentless. Consider comets and meteor showers. People of the Dark Ages noticed them, feared them, sometimes worshipped them, sometimes blamed kings or famine. A fleeting celestial flash might be recorded in a monastery chronicle, a village tale, or a poem. The description might be exaggerated, the interpretation subjective, but the underlying event is verifiable. Modern astronomy can trace the path, confirming the date and even the location. The universe, in its own quiet way, refuses to participate in the phantom time conspiracy. And there's a subtle irony here. Humans relied on the sky not just for records, but for survival. Seasons, planting schedules, tides, and navigation depended on observation. Yet those same humans could misrecord kings' reigns, omit rebellions, or exaggerate miracles. So while earthly events remain murky, the heavens offer a fixed point, a silent, incorruptible witness to history. You can almost imagine being a chronicler who notices the stars while the world around you collapses or shifts. Perhaps the harvest fails. Perhaps a king dies unexpectedly. Perhaps a village vanishes. Yet the eclipse occurs as predicted. The comet blazes across the sky regardless of human concern. It's a reminder, some truths are constant, others are fleeting, and your understanding of the past depends on distinguishing between the two. There's also poetic resonance. The Dark Ages are dark, yet the skies provide a quiet illumination. Stars and celestial events guide you through the uncertainty, offering a framework where the missing centuries, lost manuscripts, and selective chronicles can be measured against something unchanging. And in that alignment of human curiosity and cosmic order, you start to see that even the most chaotic, fragmented period of history has its constants. Congrats! You've now observed the heavens as a ledger of truth, where eclipses, comets, and planetary motions serve as immutable witnesses. You've seen how celestial events anchor human history, even when earthly records falter. In the Dark Ages, while emperors, monks, and scribes shaped memory and manuscripts vanished, the universe quietly ticked along, indifferent, precise, and unforgiving. You walk along a muddy trade route, the wheels of carts rutted deep into the dirt, horses snorting, and merchants shouting over the clatter. Coins change hands, goods are bartered, and yet, if you look closely, the economy of the Dark Ages is puzzling. Trade patterns are uneven, currencies fluctuate, and some regions suddenly leap ahead while others lag. Welcome to one of the subtler mysteries of this period, economic patterns and trade anomalies. Imagine a village that once thrived as a market center. Its roads are bustling, its storage barns full. Then, suddenly, the records, or lack thereof, show a decline. Perhaps a river shifts course, cutting off trade. Perhaps a local war disrupts supply lines. Or maybe a sudden economic boom appears somewhere else, seemingly out of nowhere. You, peering centuries later, try to map this economy, and it feels like chasing shadows. There's structure, yes, but much of it is implied rather than recorded. Coins provide one clue, though imperfect. Minted in one region, found in another, they reveal trade connections and commerce routes. Yet sometimes, the distribution seems erratic. A hoard of coins appears in a village with no apparent reason, while other areas are surprisingly empty. Archaeologists and historians puzzle over these anomalies, sometimes suggesting population movements, raids, or shifts in trade routes. And you can almost hear someone centuries later muttering, maybe the money vanished with the missing centuries, even if it didn't. Goods themselves tell a story. You notice pottery, metalwork, textiles, and salt traveling vast distances, connecting regions that seem otherwise isolated. Yet the flow is inconsistent. Some villages prosper unexpectedly, while others stagnate. You might see a sudden appearance of Mediterranean pottery in a northern village, or Scandinavian tools in a southern town. Without detailed records, it's easy to imagine a missing link, or, in the phantom time mindset, missing centuries. Reality is simpler. Trade was chaotic, opportunistic, and unpredictable. There's also the matter of labor and production. Most people are farmers, craftsmen, or local traders, surviving from season to season. The elite, nobles, monasteries, or wealthy merchants, control surplus, influence markets, and sometimes dictate the pace of innovation. A new technique, like water mills or iron tools, can appear abruptly in the archaeological record because it's spread unevenly. What looks like a gap, an anomaly, or a sudden leap in production is often just the uneven distribution of resources and knowledge. And yet, there's something poetic in the unpredictability. You, a modern observer, try to reconstruct patterns, calculate wealth flows, and map markets, but the Dark Ages resist tidy conclusions. Coins, goods, and trade routes are the traces left behind, not the full story. Economic gaps, like missing manuscripts or vanished centuries, leave space for imagination. They remind you that history isn't a perfect ledger, but a puzzle of fragments. The irony is palpable. People were surviving, trading, innovating, and struggling to make life work in an unstable world. And yet modern observers debate missing centuries, conspiracies, and phantom kings. The truth is far less glamorous, but just as compelling. Economic anomalies, like vanished manuscripts or sudden architectural leaps, reflect human resilience, resourcefulness, and the chaos of life rather than deliberate erasure. Congrats! You've now walked trade routes, examined coins, and witnessed the unpredictable flow of goods and wealth across medieval Europe. You've seen how economic patterns can appear erratic, how trade anomalies puzzle historians, and how human ingenuity and circumstance shaped markets in ways both fascinating and frustrating. In the Dark Ages, money, goods, and labor were more than just survival tools. They were threads in a complex, fragmented tapestry that continues to intrigue centuries later. You step into a village where the wind carries more than just the scent of smoke and dirt. There's an undercurrent of fear, a hushed tension that permeates the streets. The Dark Ages were not just fragmented by missing manuscripts or uneven trade, they were shaped by plague, famine, and sudden catastrophe, events that left deep marks on memory, both recorded and lost. Imagine a year when crops fail. The village granaries are nearly empty, and people grow desperate. Hunger gnaws at bodies and tempers. Children cry. Adults curse the skies. Some die quietly. Some attempt to flee. And yet, in the records that survive, if there are any, the events may be barely mentioned. A chronicler may note a poor harvest in passing, but the human suffering, the fear, and the desperation are often left unrecorded. History is sanitized, compressed, or conveniently ignored. Then consider plague. Disease could decimate entire villages, sweeping through regions unpredictably. One year, a settlement thrives. The next, half the population is gone. Burial practices become hasty, churches overflow, and social order strains to maintain itself. But manuscripts, written slowly in monasteries, often fail to capture the scale of the catastrophe. Details are lost in the urgency of survival. Oral tradition tries to preserve them, whispered warnings, tales of a year when the air itself was deadly. But over decades, stories blur, exaggerate, and sometimes vanish entirely. The consequences of these catastrophes ripple through history. Missing generations create gaps in records, incomplete genealogies, and vanished cultural knowledge. An entire community's contribution to trade, art, or local politics might disappear simply because plague or famine interrupted continuity. Buildings fall into disrepair, libraries are neglected, and what might have been recorded in calmer times is lost forever. You begin to understand why the Dark Ages feel chaotic. Real-world disasters compounded the scarcity of written records, amplifying gaps and mysteries. There's also a grim irony here. Catastrophe creates both absence and exaggeration. Some chroniclers might overstate the horrors. Half the kingdom died, while others downplay them, perhaps to avoid panic or shame. The result is a fragmented memory. Some events loom larger than life, others disappear entirely. You, looking centuries later, are left reconstructing the human experience from shadows, fragments, and occasional hyperbole. The truth is both terrifying and fascinating. And the dark humor? The same scarcity that fuels theories like phantom time is partly due to plague and famine. Life was messy, chaotic, and unpredictable. Kings came and went. Villages vanished. Labor and literacy collapsed. And from this very instability, modern minds wonder if entire centuries were invented. It's almost flattering. Humans are so creative they could imagine conspiracies in the gaps that disaster itself created. You notice something else, the resilience of memory. Even amid plague and famine, people preserved stories, orally, in small notes, in symbolic art. Tales of heroism, survival, and despair were passed down, giving future generations glimpses of what was endured. And you realize that while the Dark Ages may seem dark in records, the lived experience was vivid, complex, and often terrifyingly immediate. Congrats! You've now walked through famine-stricken fields, plague-ridden streets, and the chaotic aftermath of catastrophe. You've seen how disaster amplified the gaps in written history, obscured ordinary lives, and shaped both memory and myth. The Dark Ages were not just missing manuscripts, uneven economies, or phantom centuries. They were human, messy, and defined as much by what disappeared as by what survived. You step into a village at dusk. Candles flicker in windows. Smoke curls from chimneys. The smell of baked bread and animal dung hangs in the air. And everywhere, in the hearts of people and in whispered conversations, you sense religion and superstition intertwining like roots in a dark forest. In the Dark Ages, belief was not just personal. It was a framework for understanding the inexplicable, preserving memory, and shaping culture. Imagine a farmer staring at a failed harvest, attributing it to divine displeasure. Or a village witnessing a comet streak across the sky, interpreting it as a portent of war or plague. Every natural phenomenon, every unexpected event, was filtered through layers of belief. Monks recorded some of it in chronicles, kings commissioned stories to reinforce authority, and villagers carried oral traditions that both warned and entertained. Superstition and religion became intertwined memory keepers, shaping what survived in collective consciousness. Consider saints' lives. Miracles, visions, and acts of piety were recorded with devotion. Sometimes the accounts were accurate, often they were embellished. A minor healing became miraculous, a small act of charity became legendary. And while modern eyes may scoff, for the people of the time, these stories encoded moral lessons, survival advice, and cultural identity. In the absence of widespread literacy, these religious narratives became the framework through which history, morality, and memory were preserved. There's also the dark humor of superstition. People feared witches, ghosts, and demons, sometimes legitimately, sometimes as scapegoats for natural disasters. A crop failure might be blamed on a neighbor's curse. An unexplained illness might be attributed to spirits. And yet, in their fear and imagination, the villagers unwittingly preserved aspects of reality. Odd coincidences, strange astronomical events, and local tragedies became woven into stories that would survive centuries. The line between fact and superstition blurred, leaving you centuries later to untangle them. Religion and superstition also centralized control over memory. Church authorities determined which stories of saints, miracles, or divine retribution were written, copied, and preserved. What aligned with doctrine was amplified. What contradicted it was suppressed. Villagers' oral traditions sometimes conflicted with these official narratives, creating a tension between collective memory and institutional memory. You, observing from centuries later, see gaps, contradictions, and the occasional accidental truth slipping through. And here's the subtle beauty. While superstition may feel irrational, it anchored communities in an uncertain world. It explained disasters, preserved social norms, and gave meaning to life and death. Through ritual, story, and prayer, memories of events, both real and imagined, were encoded in ways that survived beyond parchment, beyond monasteries, and beyond individual lifespans. The Dark Ages, you realize, weren't just dark because of missing documents. They were dark because much of life existed in intangible forms that challenge modern historians. You can almost hear the echoes of these cultural memories. Chants in the chapel, whispered warnings by the fire, stories of saints and demons passed from parent to child. They are fragments of a world shaped as much by belief as by events. Every tale preserves, distorts, and interprets history simultaneously. And it's in these shadows, where faith and imagination meet, that the Dark Ages past comes alive. Congrats! You've now walked the line between faith and superstition, observed how religious narratives preserved memory, and seen how cultural beliefs both illuminated and obscured history. In this world, memory was not just written, it was performed, feared, celebrated, and endlessly interpreted. The Dark Ages were alive not only in what was recorded but in what people believed, and in those beliefs, the past persists in all its messy, fascinating complexity. You wander into a village tucked between hills and forests, where smoke rises lazily from chimneys and children chase chickens through the mud. Here, the past isn't recorded in manuscripts or coins, it lives in local legends, whispered stories, and the collective imagination of a community. History isn't written by kings or monks here, it's created, adapted, and preserved by the people themselves. Imagine an elder recounting a tale by the hearth. Perhaps a great battle occurred nearby, or a miraculous event saved the village from famine. Details may be fuzzy, names may shift, dates may vanish entirely, but the essence survives, the heroism, the warning, the pride of belonging. The villagers don't care if a chronicler would call it accurate. The story serves to shape identity, moral behavior, and communal memory. It's history in motion, alive and breathing. The irony is delicious. What survives in local memory often contradicts what's recorded in official chronicles. A king celebrated in a monastery manuscript may be remembered as cruel or foolish in village tales. A saint revered in one text may appear in folklore as a trickster or a mischief maker. And centuries later, you, peering into these layers of narrative, are left to navigate contradictions, embellishments, and gaps, trying to reconstruct something that may never have existed in official form. Consider festivals, rituals, and commemorations. They are more than celebrations. They encode stories, preserve memories, and transmit knowledge. A harvest festival may commemorate a local miracle. A ritual dance may recall a past invasion or epidemic. Even if the details are obscured, these practices maintain continuity with the past. They are living memory, an oral and performative record that withstands the fragility of manuscripts, coins, and monuments. You notice another pattern. Myth-making often arises from necessity. Villagers create legends to explain natural phenomena, justify social rules, or instill fear and respect. Rivers that flood become the domain of spirits. Mountains are home to giants. Curses punish those who break taboos. These stories are tools for understanding a world that is chaotic and dangerous. In their exaggeration and invention, they preserve truths about geography, morality, and human behavior that might otherwise vanish. And here's the darkly humorous part. These myths can make history feel simultaneously more real and more fantastical. You know that no dragon lurked in the forest, yet for centuries, villagers would swear one did. You understand that the miraculous event was likely a flood or a famine, yet in retelling, it became legendary. And that is precisely why the Dark Ages feel so mysterious. Imagination and memory intertwine, producing narratives that are both instructive and elusive. Local legends also highlight the fragility and resilience of memory. Entire communities might vanish, leaving only whispers of stories that were once told with passion. Occasionally, fragments survive. A song, a line of poetry, a marginal note, enough to hint at lives lived, struggles endured, and events witnessed. These fragments are your guide, your breadcrumbs into a past that refuses full capture. Congrats! You've now stepped into the world of local legend and myth-making, where communities created histories that existed in performance, memory, and imagination rather than ink. You've seen how stories evolve, how they preserve identity, and how they fill the gaps left by missing manuscripts, uneven trade, and vanished centuries. In the Dark Ages, the past was not only recorded, it was lived, retold, and shaped by those who remembered, ensuring that even in silence, history whispered its presence. You tread carefully through a battlefield long abandoned, the ground scarred, the air thick with the imagined scent of smoke, blood, and fear. This is the Dark Ages, where war was frequent, brutal, and often recorded inconsistently. Conflict reshaped memory as much as it reshaped lands, leaving gaps, exaggerations, and contradictions in the historical record that you, centuries later, try to piece together. Imagine a village caught between rival lords. Soldiers arrive at dawn, demand food, conscript men, and burn homes. One chronicler may record the raid in detail, the names of leaders, the strategy, the outcome. Another might skip it entirely, distracted by more important events like a coronation or miracle. And you, reading both accounts, wonder if the event truly happened or if it existed only in rumor and memory. Warfare leaves traces, but often only partial ones. Casualties compound the problem. Soldiers die. Civilians perish. Entire communities vanish. With death comes loss of knowledge, family records, oral stories, local archives. When the chronicler finally writes the history, it is filtered through those who survived, often biased, often distant from the truth. You might imagine entire villages erased, not just physically but from memory itself. This is why the Dark Ages feel so patchy. Destruction wasn't selective, it was indiscriminate, leaving empty spaces where stories once lived. There's also deliberate rewriting. Victors control memory. A defeated king may be erased from chronicles, while the victorious one is glorified. Battles may be recounted as heroic, strategic, or divinely sanctioned, depending on who writes them. And centuries later, you attempt to reconstruct a timeline from fragmented accounts, fragments of artifacts, and dubious oral tradition, trying to separate propaganda from reality. It's messy, infuriating, and oddly fascinating. Technology and tactics add another layer of mystery. Castles, fortifications, and weapons appear in the archaeological record in sudden bursts. You find a motte and bailey one century, a stone fortress the next, no documentation explaining the leap. War drives innovation, yet the uneven survival of records makes it seem like sudden jumps occurred, feeding theories of missing centuries or lost knowledge. In reality, ingenuity often emerges in response to chaos, not conspiracy. And here's the dark humor. Warfare doesn't just erase life. It erases memory, yet it ensures that some things survive in exaggerated form. A raid might become legendary, a skirmish a great battle. Heroes are magnified, defeats are minimized. Ordinary people's suffering, the real, messy human experience, is often lost. What survives is filtered, heroic, or horrifyingly simplified. You, observing centuries later, are left navigating the gap between lived reality and recorded legend. Conflict also affects trade, literacy, and culture. Roads are unsafe, villages are abandoned, schools and monasteries disrupted. The collapse of daily life amplifies gaps in records, making the already patchy historical tapestry even more fragmented. Wars are not just events. They are agents of historical erosion, scattering human memory like leaves in the wind. Congrats! You've now walked through the ruins of conflict, witnessed the selective survival of memory, and seen how warfare both destroys and shapes history. You understand that battles didn't just change borders. They reshaped what was remembered, what was recorded, and what vanished entirely. The Dark Ages are darker not merely because of missing manuscripts or phantom centuries, but because war carved gaps into memory itself, leaving shadows that historians still wander through today. You walk through a village, yet the streets feel heavier than usual. The air seems thick with anxiety. It's not just mud or smoke, there's an invisible weight here. Disease, fear, and the stress of survival, forces that shaped lives and left gaps in history that you can't always see. In the Dark Ages, epidemics weren't just medical crises. They were social disruptors, erasing knowledge, interrupting education, and silencing voices before they could be recorded. Imagine waking each day uncertain if your neighbors, your children, or even you will survive. Smallpox, dysentery, plague, diseases strike unpredictably, leaving death and trauma in their wake. Families vanish, villages shrink, and with each death, oral and written records erode. If the village chronicler falls ill, the stories of that year may disappear entirely. You realize that some missing history isn't a conspiracy, it's the consequence of human fragility in a world full of invisible threats. Mental health, though unrecorded as we understand it today, also shapes the story. Anxiety, grief, and trauma are rarely preserved in official chronicles. A farmer who loses his family to famine or disease may stop contributing to communal memory, may leave no record, may even abandon his village. Chronic stress affects decision-making, productivity, and survival, subtly influencing the trajectory of communities and the historical record itself. You begin to see how the Dark Ages aren't only dark because of missing manuscripts, but because life itself was often too overwhelming to document. Even monasteries, the supposed safe havens of literacy, were not immune. Scribes could fall ill, abbots could die suddenly, and entire libraries could be neglected or abandoned. You can imagine a scribe feverish and delirious, trying to copy texts but leaving errors, omissions, or blank pages. The work survives imperfectly, and centuries later, you are left piecing together fragments, wondering if mistakes were deliberate, accidental, or caused by exhaustion and illness. There's also social stress. Constant fear of raids, taxation, famine, or disease creates instability. Trade falters. Travel is dangerous. Education and record-keeping become secondary to survival. Entire networks of knowledge collapse not because someone wanted them gone, but because life was too fragile and unpredictable. The Dark Ages, you notice, were not dark in some mystical sense. They were chaotic, dangerous, and mentally exhausting for everyone alive. And here's the subtle irony. The invisible forces that shaped gaps in history are often overlooked. Modern scholars debate phantom centuries, missing manuscripts, and conspiracy theories. But sometimes, the simplest explanation, disease, death, mental strain, and social stress, accounts for more disappearance than any deliberate erasure ever could. Life itself was the eraser, invisible but relentless. You also notice resilience amid fragility. Even with disease and trauma, communities adapt. Oral histories, rituals, and legends persist. People find ways to preserve memory, even in incomplete or altered forms. But gaps remain, shadows cast by forces too subtle, too invisible, and too human to survive intact. Congrats! You've now witnessed the hidden hand of disease, mental strain, and social stress shaping the Dark Ages. You've seen how mortality, trauma, and daily survival created gaps in memory, distorted chronicles, and silenced voices. The Dark Ages are darker not only because of missing manuscripts or phantom time, but because life itself was unpredictable, overwhelming, and occasionally fatal, and those invisible forces left their mark on history in ways that still puzzle us today. You set out along a winding road, flanked by dense forests and rolling hills. The path is muddy, uneven, and occasionally blocked by fallen trees or flooded streams. As you trudge along, you realize something crucial. In the Dark Ages, distance itself was a barrier to history. Messages traveled slowly, news arrived late, and isolated communities developed their own timelines, disconnected from the broader world. Imagine sending a letter from one town to another. Days pass. Weeks pass. Perhaps it never arrives. Roads are dangerous. Raiders, bandits, and wild animals are constant threats. Rivers flood unexpectedly. Horses tire or die. And yet, vital information, alliances, royal decrees, military orders, must somehow reach its destination. When messages fail or are delayed, history itself bends. Decisions are made without full knowledge, battles are fought with incomplete intelligence, and records become fragmented. You can almost hear a noble grumbling. I told him to hold the bridge. Why didn't he wait? Did the message get lost in the mud again? Isolation doesn't just slow communication, it shapes culture and memory. Villages cut off by geography develop customs, stories, and even technologies independently. A festival in one valley might celebrate an event unknown to the next town over. A technique for forging tools or weaving cloth may appear in one region and remain unknown elsewhere for decades. From centuries later, it looks like sudden leaps, missing knowledge, or inexplicable anomalies. In reality, it's just a world struggling to stay connected. Trade networks are similarly affected. Merchants traveling long distances face the same hazards: pirates on rivers, rough terrain, and political instability. A shipment of salt or grain may arrive months late, if at all. Records of transactions are scattered, inconsistent, and sometimes never written down. Economic continuity, like historical memory, becomes fragmented. You begin to understand why some regions appear wealthy and technologically advanced while others seem frozen in time. It's not always a conspiracy, it's logistics. Then there's the human element. Messengers fall ill, horses die, and scribes miscopy letters. Oral communication introduces errors, embellishments, and omissions. By the time a story or instruction reaches its destination, it may be unrecognizable. You can almost imagine a general receiving instructions that said, "Hold the northern pass," only to find they were delayed, misread, or delivered incorrectly, and the resulting chaos becomes part of the historical record. Isolation also fosters local memory over universal record. Communities preserve what matters to them, not what a distant ruler or historian might consider important. The stories that survive are those repeated around the fire, copied into local manuscripts, or passed down in songs. Everything else fades. You notice a pattern. The more isolated a community, the more its history diverges from the official narrative, creating the patchwork of knowledge that defines the Dark Ages. And here's the dark humor. The very difficulties that frustrated people in their own time, dangerous travel, slow messages, treacherous terrain, now puzzle historians. Gaps in manuscripts, sudden technological leaps, and inconsistent chronicles can all be traced back to roads that are muddy, rivers that flood, and messengers who never arrive. The universe of the Dark Ages is messy, human, and occasionally absurd. Congrats! You've now navigated the challenges of communication, long-distance travel, and isolation, seeing how geography, infrastructure, and human fallibility created gaps in historical continuity. The Dark Ages are fragmented not because someone invented centuries or erased manuscripts, but because life itself was slow, dangerous, and unevenly connected, and those limits left lasting shadows in history. You step outside into a chill wind that seems to cut through your cloak. The sky is gray, the soil soggy, and the river swollen from recent rains. In the Dark Ages, climate and environmental shifts weren't just background details. They were forces that shaped societies, disrupted life, and left gaps in history that echo centuries later. Imagine a sudden, unexpected cold snap in early spring. Crops fail. Livestock die. Villagers go hungry. Families scramble to survive, leaving little time for record-keeping or scholarly pursuits. A monastery may postpone copying manuscripts. A scribe may prioritize feeding the abbey over documenting history. The environmental crisis erases continuity. History isn't deliberately lost. It's simply overwhelmed by the pressing demands of survival. Then consider floods and droughts. A river might overflow, destroying homes and farmland. Roads become impassable. Trade collapses. Entire villages relocate. Archaeological evidence later shows abandoned settlements, scattered artifacts, and unexplained gaps in economic activity. At first glance, it might seem like deliberate erasure, missing centuries, or cultural collapse. In reality, nature itself intervened, dictating which records survive and which vanish. Environmental changes also amplify human crises. Famine, disease, and social stress intensify during harsh climate periods. Mortality rises, oral traditions are interrupted, and written records are neglected or destroyed. You can almost hear a villager muttering, "If the harvest fails again, who will remember us at all?" The answer, probably no one, except fragments, stories, and traces scattered across centuries. There's also the subtle effect on infrastructure. Buildings decay faster in harsh climates. Roads erode. Bridges collapse. Monasteries and castles suffer from storms, floods, and shifting terrain. Reconstruction is slow, sometimes incomplete. The physical world itself leaves scars, gaps, and puzzles for later generations. Archaeologists find foundations without roofs, walls without context, and a historical record shaped as much by climate as by human design. You notice patterns emerge when you step back. Climatic shifts correlate with societal upheaval. The Little Ice Age, volcanic eruptions, and prolonged droughts force migrations, alter trade routes, and disrupt political stability. Life becomes unpredictable. Written records, economic continuity, and oral traditions are stressed to their limits. The Dark Ages are darker not because of malevolent intent, but because humans faced relentless environmental pressures, leaving history patchy and incomplete. Here's the irony. Modern readers often think missing manuscripts or phantom centuries are conspiratorial, but much of what vanishes is the result of forces entirely beyond human control. Floods, harsh winters, or a failing crop can erase an entire year of memory. History, you realize, is fragile not just because people are forgetful or deceitful, but because life itself is fragile. And yet, humans persist. Oral traditions, adaptive technologies, and local resilience preserve fragments of knowledge. Communities innovate around environmental challenges, leaving subtle traces for centuries to come. A relocated settlement, a new irrigation system, a story of a river that changed course. These small threads survive in spite of chaos, giving you glimpses of the past while leaving gaps that spark mystery. Congrats! You've now walked through the impact of climate and environmental change, observing how floods, famine, and weather extremes shape societies and the historical record. You've seen how nature itself contributed to fragmented memory, uneven development, and lost knowledge. The Dark Ages are darker not only because of human limitations, but because the environment wrote its own unpredictable and relentless history into the lives and memories of those who lived it. You step into a dimly lit chapel, dust motes drifting lazily in the sunlight streaming through a tiny stained glass window. On the walls, you see murals, frescoes, and carvings, remnants of a world that often chose symbol and image over written words to preserve memory. In the Dark Ages, when manuscripts vanish and records are incomplete, art and artifacts act as silent witnesses, speaking in a language you must learn to interpret. Imagine examining a carved stone, worn smooth by centuries of weather. The imagery depicts a battle, a saint, or a local legend. Names are absent. Dates are uncertain. And yet, the story survives, partially, indirectly, through symbolism and iconography. Each artifact is a puzzle piece, a fragment of memory preserved physically rather than linguistically. You realize that reconstructing history is like reading a secret code left by people long gone. Consider illuminated manuscripts when they survive. Even a small image in the margin, a goat climbing a hill, a soldier's helmet, a celestial alignment, tells you something about the culture, priorities, and understanding of the world at that time. Sometimes, a single illustration reveals more than pages of text ever could. Fashion, tools, architecture, and social roles are all embedded in the art. And here's the subtle humor. People centuries later are still interpreting, debating, and occasionally misreading the obvious. That goat? Maybe it's a warning about greed. Maybe it's just a goat. We may never know. Artifacts extend beyond art. Coins, pottery, jewelry, weapons, even mundane tools, provide tangible evidence of trade, technology, and daily life. You hold a bronze axe and feel the weight of a vanished craftsman's skill. You examine a shard of painted pottery and imagine the hands that shaped it, the meals it held, the stories told around its owner's hearth. These objects are enduring voices from the past, often outlasting parchment, oral tradition, and even entire settlements. Symbolism adds layers of complexity. Religious motifs, heraldry, and iconographic conventions encode beliefs, hierarchies, and values. A dragon, a saint, a crowned figure, each conveys messages both obvious and subtle. You begin to understand that surviving artifacts are not just aesthetic, they are records in disguise, offering insight into how people understood their world, what they feared, what they celebrated, and what they wanted remembered. There's also an ironic twist. Art and artifacts can mislead. Interpretations shift with context. A saint depicted performing a miracle might exaggerate events. A battle scene may glorify one side. Everyday objects may be misattributed or misunderstood by archaeologists centuries later. And yet, even flawed, these items provide more continuity than missing manuscripts, vanished libraries, or oral traditions lost to time. They are persistent, tangible threads connecting you to people who might otherwise have vanished entirely. You notice how resilient these objects are. Even when fires consume libraries or floods destroy settlements, art and artifacts endure, hidden in crypts, buried in mud, or passed down as family heirlooms. They are the stubborn survivors, bearing silent witness to societies that might otherwise exist only as shadows. And centuries later, you study them, piecing together the story from fragments of wood, stone, and metal, bridging gaps that no written record can fill. Congrats! You've now explored how art, symbolism, and surviving artifacts preserve history when words fail. You've seen how imagery, tools, and objects act as resilient messengers from the past, revealing culture, technology, and belief across centuries. The Dark Ages, fragmented as they are still alive in these physical traces, waiting for careful eyes to interpret their stories and illuminate the gaps left by time. You wander through a village market, listening to the chatter of merchants, farmers, and travelers. Words tumble across the air, familiar yet strange, a patchwork of dialects, accents, and regional slang. In the Dark Ages, language itself was a barrier to historical continuity, shaping memory, preserving culture selectively, and sometimes obscuring events entirely. Imagine trying to read a chronicle written in a dialect that has since vanished. Words are misspelled, grammar unfamiliar, meanings shifted. A simple instruction about taxation or harvest might be indecipherable. Oral traditions, too, evolve rapidly. A story told in one valley might change dramatically by the time it reaches another town. You realize that even when information survives, it can be garbled, reshaped, or misunderstood simply because language is fluid, living, and resistant to perfect preservation. Consider Latin, the language of the church and learned scribes. It dominates official records, yet few common people spoke it fluently. Local events, disputes, and innovations often went unrecorded because there was no shared language capable of capturing them. Meanwhile, local dialects and vernaculars flourished, carrying stories orally but leaving no written trace. A historian centuries later encounters fragments of meaning, a word, a phrase, a misunderstood idiom, and must reconstruct context, intent, and significance. It's like decoding a secret code written by a disappearing culture. Language evolution also creates chronological confusion. Words change meaning over decades. Phrases that once described mundane events might later be interpreted as significant or vice versa. A plague could mean an epidemic, a curse, or simply an infestation of locusts. The scribe's words, when read centuries later, can mislead, exaggerate, or downplay events. You start to see how gaps in understanding may not indicate missing centuries, but the natural drift of human speech. Dialects themselves vanish. Entire regions may speak a tongue that dies with the last speaker. Stories, legal codes, recipes, and local knowledge vanish along with them. Oral tradition preserves fragments, but nuances and precise meanings are lost. You can almost imagine a scholar centuries later finding a manuscript, puzzled. They wrote this in a language no one alive today can read properly. What were they trying to say? This linguistic drift is another invisible reason the Dark Ages feel fragmented. There's also an ironic twist. People's attempts to standardize language, creating Latin texts, codifying laws, or promoting uniform religious texts, inadvertently erased variations, leaving a false sense of continuity. Local adaptations, slang, and regional innovation disappeared, further obscuring the reality of life in smaller communities. The gaps you notice in the historical record are not only physical or social, they are linguistic, embedded in the very words people use to remember and communicate. Yet language preserves more than it obscures. Place names, family names, proverbs, and idiomatic expressions survive as breadcrumbs of past culture. They reveal trade routes, migrations, and social structures. Even when manuscripts vanish, words endure, carrying fragments of memory across centuries. In the Dark Ages, language is both a veil and a bridge, simultaneously obscuring history and preserving it in unexpected ways. Congrats! You've now wandered through the evolution of language and vanished dialects, seeing how communication itself shapes what survives of history. Words mutate, vanish, and shift in meaning, creating gaps that seem like lost centuries but are really the natural result of linguistic change. In the Dark Ages, language was a living, breathing entity, fragile, unpredictable, and central to the way communities preserved, distorted, and transmitted memory. You enter a hall of local governance, a modest building of timber and stone, echoing with the voices of clerks, bailiffs, and citizens disputing minor grievances. In the Dark Ages, legal systems and record-keeping were both lifelines and labyrinths, shaping what survives in history and leaving enormous gaps in our understanding of everyday life. Imagine a scribe tasked with documenting court proceedings. A dispute arises over land boundaries, taxes, or livestock theft. The scribe writes quickly, abbreviating words, omitting names, and sometimes skipping entire details deemed unimportant. The parchment survives, maybe a few fragments, but much is lost to moisture, fire, or reuse. And centuries later, you read it puzzled. Who owned what? Which king ruled? Which village existed at all? This is how administrative gaps form, unintentionally, invisibly, and persistently. Legal records were inconsistent across regions. Some kingdoms kept meticulous charters, documenting property, trade agreements, and taxes. Others relied on oral testimony or local memory. When a dispute arose in a remote village, the record might exist only in the memory of elders. Years later, when scholars attempt to piece together population numbers, land ownership, or governance, these gaps appear as empty pages, missing centuries, or strange anomalies. There's also the issue of lost or repurposed documents. Charters, ledgers, and tax records were often written on perishable materials, parchment, vellum, or even wooden tablets. Fires, floods, and general neglect destroyed them. And occasionally, a scribe would reuse old parchment, scraping off previous writing to save material. You can almost imagine someone a century later examining the faint traces of erased ink, sighing and thinking, so much for that year. Who knows what vanished with it? The complexity of administration itself introduces errors. Clerks miscalculate taxes, misrecord heirs, or confuse dates. Reigns of kings and local lords might overlap ambiguously in different records. One town's charter claims the year is 765, another claims 772. Mistakes compound over decades, creating historical uncertainty. You begin to realize that the Dark Ages feel phantom, in part because administrative continuity was fragile, uneven, and imperfect. Legal systems also reflected power, not reality. Laws were often written by elites to protect their interests, leaving the experiences of peasants, artisans, and women mostly invisible. Many day-to-day disputes, agreements, and tragedies went unrecorded. Oral memory tried to fill in the gaps, but as you've seen in previous sections, oral tradition is malleable, subject to forgetfulness, exaggeration, and reinterpretation. The combination of sparse records and biased documentation makes reconstructing history a detective story filled with invisible clues. And here's the dark humor. Centuries later, scholars debate missing centuries or phantom rulers, when often the missing history was never formally recorded in the first place. Life happened, people traded, farmed, fought, and survived, yet the paper trail is inconsistent, fragmentary, and fragile. Administrative gaps created the illusion of erasure, feeding the myths of lost time and hidden history. Congrats! You've now explored the intricate world of legal systems, record-keeping, and administrative gaps. You've seen how imperfect documentation, biased authority, lost charters, and fragile materials shaped what survives of the past. The Dark Ages are fragmented not only by missing manuscripts or natural disasters, but by the practical realities of governance, bureaucracy, and human error, leaving shadows that continue to puzzle historians today. You sit by the fire, the embers glowing faintly, shadows stretching across the walls of a humble hut. The Dark Ages surround you, not as a single monolithic void, but as a complex tapestry of chaos, resilience, and fragmentary memory. After walking through plague-stricken villages, flooded fields, isolated valleys, and forgotten monasteries, you finally begin to see why this period feels mysterious, why historians, archaeologists, and casual observers alike are drawn into its shadows. Consider what you've witnessed. Missing manuscripts, uneven trade, and political upheaval. Epidemics, famine, and social stress. Isolated communities, evolving languages, and inconsistent record-keeping. Artifacts, symbols, and oral traditions filling gaps left by lost documents. Warfare, superstition, climate, and bureaucracy, all converging to create a world that appears both real and fantastical at the same time. The darkness isn't magic or conspiracy, it's the cumulative result of countless human, environmental, and cosmic forces interacting over centuries. And here's the irony. The Dark Ages feel mysterious not because someone invented 300 years or erased knowledge on purpose, though that makes a better story, but because life itself was fragile, chaotic, and unevenly documented. Survival, necessity, and circumstance dictated what was remembered, recorded, or lost. The stars kept perfect time, rivers shifted unpredictably, and roads failed when you needed them most. The past wasn't neat. It wasn't continuous. And yet, in its gaps, it became mesmerizing, puzzling, and seductive. Every factor you've explored contributes to this illusion of mystery. Climate forced migrations, famine and disease reduced populations, warfare scattered communities, language drift obscured understanding, and record-keeping was uneven at best. Artifacts preserved fragments, oral traditions kept stories alive, and superstition and religion filled voids with meaning. The Dark Ages are fragmented not because humans failed, but because life itself was unforgiving, messy, and sometimes absurdly cruel. Think about it. A monastery burns, a village is flooded, a scribe dies of fever, a comet streaks overhead, and generations later you're trying to reconstruct what happened from a fragment of pottery, a charred page, and a legend whispered by elders. You can almost smile at the audacity of trying to impose order on chaos, yet that is exactly what historians do. The Dark Ages are less a conspiracy than a cumulative human, environmental, and celestial prank played across centuries. And the subtle beauty of it? Even in its gaps and inconsistencies, the Dark Ages were alive. People adapted, innovated, traded, fought, loved, feared, and celebrated. Culture, technology, and memory persisted. Sometimes imperfectly, sometimes obscured, but persistently nonetheless. Every artifact, every story, every fragmented record you study is proof that life refused to be entirely erased, even when circumstances were cruel or chaotic. So, as you sit in the dim glow of your imagination, you realize that the Dark Ages are mysterious precisely because they are human, not because someone deliberately erased 300 years, but because humans lived, survived, and sometimes forgot in ways that left an incomplete trail. Mystery isn't always intentional. Sometimes it's simply the natural outcome of life under duress. Congrats! You've now traveled through the fragmented, chaotic, and fascinating world of the Dark Ages. You've explored disease, famine, isolation, superstition, art, language, trade, and bureaucracy, and you've seen how all these forces converge to create gaps in memory and record. The Dark Ages feel mysterious because history is messy, life is unpredictable, and survival often took precedence over documentation. And in that messiness, the past whispers to you, half remembered, half lost, endlessly compelling. You lean back, the fire crackling, and for a moment, the shadows of the Dark Ages feel alive. They are neither entirely lost nor fully known, and perhaps that is why we are still drawn to them, still trying to piece together the story from fragments, artifacts, and imagination. The darkness is human, chaotic, and fascinating, and in its shadows, history continues to breathe.